Good afternoon. A real pleasure to be here, and I think it's a real testament to the excitement and potential of autonomous technologies and vehicles to see such a full room here, and also to the skills and talents of our organisers. So thank you very much to Lucas and Ross and the team as well. I'm getting some feedback from that, can I? Yep. Cheers. So my name's Arthur Kay. I guess there are a few roles why it's relevant for me to talk to you today. The first is as a board member of Transport for London. The second as a board member of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And the third is as a professor of practice at UCL's Bartlett School of the Built Environment. But I'm under strict instructions to say that I'm not talking to you in an official capacity. I'm talking to you instead as the author of this book, Roadkill, which is mentioned here, and it doesn't pull many punches in terms of views in terms of what the kind of upsides and downsides in terms of where we're going with some of these autonomous technologies. And my aim today is to really try and land to some of the people in this room who I'm sure have thought about some of these issues in details, but there's a world that we're going to create phenomenally better cities. And again, we need to remember that with all of us, we should be thinking about not just our shareholders, wherever they may be, but indeed about what the long-term future of how we can make our cities better places or worse places. I'm going to kind of use this relatively simplistic, childlike frame throughout in terms of these different pathways that we can use throughout this. This is actually an image from a great blogger called Tim Urban, who has a blog called Wait But Why, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But it really paints this picture in terms of we are where we are now. I believe that we're now at a tipping point in terms of autonomous technologies, and particularly how they're going to be deployed across European cities, and how we can frame this in terms of actually shaping a future that is genuinely better versus, as I say, simply focused on shareholder value. And to put the issue bluntly in terms of what that worst case could look like, we're peering into a future where we have millions, 72,000 maybe for the UK, an optimistically small number, but we have millions across Europe of dispersed, connected, 2-ton surface drones with known cyber vulnerabilities operating in continuous proximity with the 340 million Europeans who live in cities. So this is not a small issue in terms of how we may reshape our cities in the future. And as I say, the book Roadkill takes a pretty harsh view in terms of what the automotive industry did to our cities in the 20th century. This is what many of parts of our cities look like under a fossil fuel car future. This is what many of our cities look like under an electric car reality today or a near future. And my fear is that this is what our cities will look like under an autonomous car future. So let's be very careful what we wish for. And the kind of simple piece is that many of us, and I think people are enjoying their time in London on a nice day like today, but many of us enjoy places which have the option of a taxi, a car to be able to driven home, etc., but not the obligation of it. And can we make sure that when we bring through these new technologies, as many other technologies have been brought in today, that we make sure that people are at the centre of it, and that we ensure that this is accessible for walking, wheeling, cycling, and public transport, and some of the technologies that we're hearing about today can be included in that mix as well. So let's kind of bear this in mind as I kind of whiz through this. And so the potential benefits, I don't need to bore you about the potential benefits. Many of you are very familiar with these. There are huge potential upsides of integrating autonomous technologies throughout our existing infrastructure and supply chains and mobility systems. I'm sure everyone here is a huge fan of what this could do in terms of that upside scenario, and so I'm not going to bore you further with that, but I just want to acknowledge that there are huge potential upsides if this is deployed correctly, and that you guys and the regulators all operate, get on well and fair this. And those potential upsides have been sold to the public for several generations. This is from the 1950s. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image. And we've really come a long way in terms of our marketing, because this is from this year. So we're kind of getting there in terms of that. We have a thing that kind of looks a bit like a car, and you can kind of do cool stuff in it, and it kind of has a glass roof. And this is kind of where we're at, and it kind of whiz around. The previous one, you'll be surprised to hear, is an advert put out by both General Electric and General Motors working together. So collaboration has always been at the heart of the vision of what autonomy can be. But what I'm more interested in, or I guess more concerned about, is some of the potential risks and downsides of this. Again, I'm not going to take you through all of these because I know that you will have done some very deep thinking in the dark nights of the soul, looking into it and saying, what future are we building for our cities? But the one I'm particularly, and we can, maybe for another day, we can go through 1 to 5, but the one I'm particularly interested in talking about today is one I think that has been severely overlooked, and that's one of sovereignty and national security. So first, and the reason I think this is interesting is part of an ongoing and wider debate that's happening across Europe around some of these issues, around what future do we want. This has been brought on by obviously kind of wider geopolitical challenges, but the physical AI and the iteration of autonomous vehicles at this specific point in time, in this specific place, could not be more timely or more relevant to a national or even an international debate on some of these matters. So I want to just briefly say a few words on these two issues of national security and sovereignty. So first, as we look at national security, the key piece here is around what's the core difference between a driver being there and not being there. We already know that there's a huge number of cars in Europe and indeed in the world. So why am I standing here boring you about this subject? So in terms of national security, there are different factors that are fundamental to what an autonomous car is. So what they are, where they are, so who controls them, how many ways exist to attack them, how many there will be. There are not that many today, but there will be a lot. I hope all of your business plans show this, I'm sure. So there will be a lot in the near future, we all hope, and how big and fast they are. So we know that already that vehicles are used as attack vehicles across the world. I mean, in the first bit of 2025 alone, we saw attacks in New Orleans in January, Munich and Krakow in February, Mannheim in March, Vancouver in April, New Taipei City and Liverpool in May, Los Angeles in July. I could go on. So we know that these places are used to attack already quite regularly. And modern vehicles, actually I wonder, do we have many kind of cybersecurity experts in the room today by a show of hands? Or people who do kind of cyber work within their organizations? Let the record show I see 0 hands. Oh no, one hand here. Okay, good. That's why next time we need to get a few more positions. So I mean, actually, we don't need to go particularly into the technical details, but what this slide is really looking to show is that we have different ways of attacking vehicles, different attack types, different attack vectors within those, and then different attack surfaces that sit within that. And so as we think of cyber when it comes to actually most connected and modern vehicles, but specifically when it comes to autonomous vehicles, that these are some of the ways that some of your colleagues in your cyber divisions will be thinking about these things. And it's been shown across both many modern cars and also autonomous cars that attacks are easy. Maybe I'm not technical, so easy may be a hyper thing, but have been done in both research and grey hat hacking environments. So the second is kind of how many robotaxis there'll be. I was advised last night that the 6,000 figure, which is from McKinsey in December, is probably already out of date because you guys are doing great jobs in terms of scaling this up already. But let's say there's around 10,000 robotaxis commercially operating in the world today. There are roughly 1.7 billion cars in the world today. And I guess there's some theories that we may be able to reduce the total number of cars and reduce the number of robotaxis, et cetera, but let's just say there are going to be millions or tens of millions of robotaxis operating on our streets by the 2030s. And so there's just recapping here, these are used as attacks already. There's lots of attack vulnerabilities that exist and are currently shown to be able to exist within these vehicles, and there are going to be lots of them operating in our cities very soon. And indeed, our friend in California reminds us that someday this is from CES earlier this year, every truck, every car will be autonomous, which is a vision I'm sure many of you hold. And the second is in terms of what are these things? Like, what is the form factor of a robo-taxi today? And these are, very crudely, heavy, roughly double the weight of an average European car. And also they are very fast, thanks in part to electric motors and power drives. So the vehicle on the left can reach 100 kilometers an hour in roughly 2 seconds, the one on the right in roughly 4.5 seconds. So these are fast, heavy machines, and as I say, operating alongside the 3 and 4 Europeans who live in cities. And so my kind of key point in terms of from a national security perspective is that we need to think of robotaxis and equivalents not as consumer electronics, which is currently closer to how they're regulated, and more like drones. And this may sound hyperbolic and scary because we think of drones in military applications, but we know drones have civilian applications as well, and that is technically what they are. Robotaxis are fleets of corporate-controlled 2-ton surface drones. So from a regulatory perspective, and frankly, you guys as working for some of these organizations, I think we need to call a spade, and this is what you're building and what you're selling, and that's fine, but let's call a spade. The second is in terms of sovereignty. And this is a deeper issue here, and did anyone here study, do kind of political science or political philosophy at university? Any kind of uber nerds in the room? Great. So you probably remember your Hobbes and the kind of idea of the Leviathan back in the day. And this really raises a question in terms of what is sovereignty when it comes to technology. And I'm sure many of you are well versed, especially the people working on public policy in your organizations at the moment, are well versed on this very challenging question, and candidly, where Europe is at the moment in terms of our ability to say this question, we are sovereign when it comes to technology. And this is the question that I think there are colleagues from the Department for Business and Trade and from Department for Transport here today, and I know that we indeed in the UK are, I think next week, launching our sovereign AI fund with our Chancellor shortly. We've had everyone from Ursula von der Leyen to Macron to others talking at the Munich Security Conference and other places about the importance of technology sovereignty in Europe. And the question that this comes down to is, can a country, or indeed a city, control, regulate, and shape the critical technologies that affect society? And I think the fans and the naysayers of autonomous cars and technologies will say that this will be a critical technology that affects society. And the question is, do we as a nation state or as a city have the ability to impact that? And there are three framing questions that some of the thinkers in this space try and break this down into. The first is around data sovereignty. Who owns the data? Where is it managed, etc. The second is around that core technology sovereignty in terms of the tech stack, hardware, software, infrastructure, security to run the technologies, and to make sure that can be, not necessarily always owned entirely, but can be controlled and operated locally. And the third, from an operational sovereignty perspective, on that ongoing maintenance and management of these operations. And this has become very, in the military technology space and Mr. Trump's actions in recent months, this has become a very real discussion for many European governments, looking at nothing as kinetic or potentially kinetic as autonomous vehicles, but simply looking at things like cloud systems, email systems, conference calling, etc. So France, for example, has recently had a directive to be able to move their conference calling from a US provider over to a French or domestic European provider because of these exact pieces. And that's obviously much less acute and potentially kinetic than what we're talking about here today. But these are examples of how that is currently happening across Europe today. And again, when we think of the organizations that are working this through, this is not saying that these are kind of, we still think, and I still think in my mind of people like Alphabet, Google as a startup, because they frame themselves in that kind of storytelling base. But these are enormous companies, and this is the only economy in Europe that is bigger in GDP than the market cap of these organizations is Germany. The UK is smaller than Nvidia and Alphabet, which is quite embarrassing. Russia is going toe-to-toe with Amazon. And even poor old Greece is only just a bit bigger than Uber. So I don't know what's Bolt's market cap these days, but I mean, you'll be around there somewhere as well, kind of bigger than a couple of European countries as well. So these should be thought of much closer to, in the same way we should be thinking of as robotaxis not as a piece of consumer electronics, but as a drone. We should be thinking of big tech organizations, whether they're European, Chinese, or American, as akin to nation states and able to really dictate public policy to a very great extent. And this is, again, this point around what is sovereignty when it comes to these issues. But big tech is aware of this, and they get it. Hey, we get it. And so what they did at the Munich Security Conference is they launched something which is fantastic. It's called the Trusted Tech Alliance. And it is what it says on the tin. It's an alliance. We are your friend. We are going to come together and we're going to work closely with you to work this out. We're going to regulate ourselves. Heard this before, I'm sure. We're going to regulate ourselves because we know the technology. You guys are stupid bureaucrats. We know the technology. Let's regulate ourselves, tell you how to manage us. And this, I think, should be rebranded. The Fox's Guide to Hen Security. So this is, you know, we are literally giving all our power over to these guys and then saying, oh, and tell us how to regulate you. And this is the framing that we need to be thinking of this much more carefully. And so where I fear we're getting to with this, we've seen big tech take over a lot in terms of both our economies and in terms of how we spend our time, how our children spend our time, our mental health, a whole bunch of other things. And we've seen how the car industrial complex has dominated our urban space, our wallets, our time. And the alliance is going to be nasty. That's what I've got to say. We need to be very careful about how we do it and how we I'm not saying don't do it, I'm saying how we do it. How we integrate these amazing technologies and technologists into our cities, into our future to make life genuinely better for Europeans and for citizens. And the sovereignty issue is our strange chap at the top here having a look down. So in terms of a few suggestions or recommendations in terms of how we may begin to think about particularly these two issues. There are obviously many other issues we need to think about, but these particular issues in terms of sovereignty and national security. The first is to ensure that the costs are fully covered to cities. There is a cost that needs to be, will be borne here by the host cities. The second is around correctly identifying and calling a spade. What are these things and how do we regulate them like what they are rather than what they tell us they are? And the third is let's plan way out. We shouldn't be thinking tomorrow, we should be thinking what's happening, as some of the previous speakers said, what's happening in 2035, 2045, 2055. So first let's look at cost. Today, without getting too deep into the economics of this, we're talking about negative externalities. So there's a cost to me driving my car around, but what's the cost to society of me driving around? So by a well-reviewed expert, roughly it costs society around $76 a kilometre driven around. Now we can debate that, is that 25 cents, or cents, excuse me, 76 cents per kilometre driven around. Is that 25 cents, is that $1.20? But there's a price that we can assign to it. Then there's a cost that cities, and they tried to capture this at the moment a bit already with things like road taxes or ULEZ or whatever it happens to be. There are charges that cities already levy in different ways to be able to cover some of these costs. So the second piece is that as part of this, there's going to be new physical infrastructure, and some of you I know are building it, that is needed for cities to accommodate these new technologies, and that needs to be covered and incorporated into this. Second is the new digital infrastructure, and this is both the ongoing OPEX and CAPEX of this, so both continuous cyber assurance, for example, or operating geofencing or whatever it happens to be. These are things that need to have their costs fully covered. And then finally, the enforcement, legal and regulatory requirements for this. I think previous speakers have spoken about bills going through Parliament, various things like this, but there's going to be ways that this works that is different from historically, and that needs to be covered as we work through this as well. So the first piece is let's make sure that these costs are fully covered, and maybe some of the more benevolent of you will go in and suggest this to regulators and partners rather than wait for them to suggest it to you. The second is let's know what we're regulating. Now, a robo-van, as designed by Tesla, may look suspiciously like a toaster, but it is not a toaster. And at the moment, many of the regulations that we're currently looking at are much closer to consumer electronics. But the reality is that a smartphone, a fridge, or a toaster cannot do that much damage to you if it wants to. If a really evil fridge can only do so much, but a really, a hacked 2-ton plus van or car can do quite a lot of damage. So we need to be thinking of these as 2-ton surface drones, not as toasters. And then the third piece is from our friend Mr. Gates. So let's think out what's happening here. We overestimate the change in 2 years, and I'm sure many of our business plans will be wrong, not because they're wrong in 50 years, but because they're wrong in how that inflection point works. But we overestimate what happens in 2 years and underestimate the next 10. And I may be saying actually we underestimate the next 20, 30, 40. If we think about how, let's say, different technologies have arrived in our cities in the past 100 years, they really haven't shown up in a significant way for at least 20 years into operation. So that's really how I believe we should be thinking about this from an integration perspective. So I want to end where I began, and I also look forward to your heckles and comments and questions afterwards as we get into the debate and discussion on this. But where I began, which is that autonomous vehicles and technologies are knocking at the gates of European cities. They want to be let in. And handled wisely, they could support potentially safer streets, cleaner cities, freeing up urban space, more inclusive mobility. However, my fear is that if handled poorly, they could deepen our dependence on the car and on big tech and the car industrial complex, create new security vulnerabilities, erode public control in public and critical infrastructure, and hand over our sovereignty to big tech. And the choice before us is not a technical one. I think a lot of people in this room have worked unbelievably hard to solve some of those technical challenges in terms of that, and we heard from people building ground-up cars earlier and different people in the tech stack throughout today, which is amazing. So not to take away from the amazing things you built and will continue to build, but it is actually about political choices and around sovereignty as we integrate these technologies. Our friend, I think she's just down here, the head of MI6, if anyone's walking, she gave a speech at the end of last year talking about some of these threats. She said, "The defining challenge of the 21st century is not simply who wields the most powerful technologies, but who guides them with the greatest wisdom." And my question to you as technologists, as entrepreneurs, as business people, and indeed to policymakers and mayors listening, we should really heed her words, as they will determine whether and on what terms autonomous cars and vehicles should be invited into our cities. Thank you very much.